Have you ever wondered if a single desperate decision could unlock a fortune that's been waiting for you for over 150 years? What if I told you that a struggling single mother's last-ditch effort to save her family would lead her to discover the Jesse James Gang's legendary $40 million gold vault, hidden beneath the rotting floorboards of a foreclosed plantation that everyone else was too afraid to buy? If you believe that sometimes our darkest moments are actually doorways to our greatest destinies, give this video a like right now and subscribe to our channel. What you're about to hear will forever change how you view those moments when life pushes you to the very edge, when you have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a woman who lost everything but refused to give up, and how a crumbling antebellum mansion in rural Mississippi became the key to rewriting not just her future, but her understanding of what it means to truly fight for your family. I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll discover how sometimes the most dangerous gambles lead to the most extraordinary rewards. Stay with me as we uncover a journey that proves when you're willing to bet everything on yourself, the universe has a way of betting on you too. In the suffocating heat of a Mississippi summer, where the air hangs thick with humidity and broken dreams, Sarah Martinez sat in her rusted Honda Civic, staring at the crumbling facade of Magnolia Grove Plantation. At 34, Sarah carried the weight of the world in her tired brown eyes, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from a single bad day, but from years of fighting battles that seemed designed to break her spirit. Her dark hair, streaked prematurely with silver, was pulled back in a practical ponytail that had seen better days, much like everything else in her life. The plantation house loomed before her like something from a Gothic novel, its white columns stained with decades of neglect, its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of rotting wood and shattered dreams. Vines had claimed the eastern wall, creating a tapestry of green that almost disguised the broken windows and missing shutters. The property had been on the market for 3 years, its asking price dropping with each passing month as potential buyers were scared away by the sheer magnitude of restoration required. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the steering wheel, not from fear of the imposing structure, but from the enormity of what she was about to do. In her purse sat a cashier's check for $47,000, every penny she had managed to scrape together from the sale of her grandmother's jewelry, her ex-husband's tools that he'd left behind, and a small insurance settlement from her mother's, passing 6 months earlier, $47,000 to buy a plantation that had originally been listed at $340,000. The bank was so desperate to get rid of the property that they'd accepted her lowball offer within hours, a decision that should have felt like victory, but instead felt like stepping off a cliff into an abyss. Her phone buzzed with a text from her babysitter back in Jackson. Emma asking when Mommy coming home. Told her after dinner like you said. Sarah's heart clenched as she thought of her 8-year-old daughter, the bright-eyed little girl who still believed her mother could fix anything, who didn't yet understand that sometimes adults made promises they weren't sure they could keep. Emma had been born with a rare heart condition that required ongoing medical treatment, the kind of specialized care that insurance covered in theory but left families drowning in co-pays, deductibles, and out-of-network charges in reality. Sarah's nursing job at Jackson Memorial had barely covered their basic expenses even before the medical bills began mounting into something that felt insurmountable. The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, leaving Sarah with primary custody, and her ex-husband Marcus with a monthly child support obligation that he honored about as often as Mississippi saw snow. The last time she'd seen him, he'd been boarding a Greyhound bus to Louisiana with promises to send money once he got on his feet, promises that had so far materialized into exactly 3 payments of $200 each. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photos she'd taken during her first visit to the property 2 weeks earlier. Room after room of faded grandeur, wallpaper peeling in elegant strips, hardwood floors that groaned under the weight of decades, but still showed hints of their original beauty beneath layers of dust and neglect. The real estate agent, a nervous young man named Trevor, who seemed perpetually surprised that anyone was interested in the property, had walked her through the main house with the enthusiasm of someone giving a tour of a haunted asylum. "Foundation's solid," he'd said, knocking on a doorframe that immediately shed a shower of paint chips. "Just needs some cosmetic work. Sarah had almost laughed at the euphemism. The house needed everything. New electrical, updated plumbing, roof repairs, window replacements, and that was just to make it habitable. Her plan, if it could be called a plan, was to live in the small caretaker's cottage behind the main house, while slowly renovating the plantation into a bed and breakfast. The cottage, according to Trevor, was move-in ready, which in real estate speak meant it had running water and electricity, even if the water ran brown for the first few minutes and the electricity flickered whenever the wind blew. But it was shelter and, more importantly, it was theirs. No more rent payments to a landlord who raised prices every year while the air conditioning stayed broken for months at a time. Sarah had done the math countless times, staying up until 3 in the morning with a calculator and a notepad, trying to make the numbers work. The bed and breakfast market in rural Mississippi wasn't exactly booming, but there was something to be said for authenticity, for offering guests a genuine plantation experience rather than some sanitized tourist attraction. The property sat on 47 acres of what had once been productive farmland, now largely overgrown, but still retaining the bones of its agricultural past. A creek ran along the northern boundary, and massive oak trees dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels, their Spanish moss creating natural curtains that filtered the harsh Mississippi sun. More importantly, the property was only 90 minutes from both Jackson and Memphis, close enough to civilization to attract weekend visitors, but far enough removed to offer the kind of peace that city dwellers paid premium prices to experience. Sarah had researched similar properties in Louisiana and Georgia, places where enterprising owners had turned crumbling historical properties into profitable ventures. The key was authenticity, she'd learned. Modern travelers, especially those with disposable income, weren't looking for another generic hotel experience. They wanted stories, atmosphere, the feeling that they were stepping back in time. Magnolia Grove had stories in abundance, even if most of them were whispered rather than spoken aloud. The plantation had been built in 1847 by Colonel Benjamin Whitmore, a man whose fortune had been built on cotton and whose legacy had been complicated by the brutal realities of antebellum economics. Sarah had spent hours at the local historical society, reading through archived newspapers and plantation records, trying to understand not just the history of the property, but how to present that history responsibly. The house had survived the Civil War largely intact, though family stories suggested that Union troops had camped on the property for several weeks in 1863. After the war, the Whitmore family had struggled to maintain the plantation without enslaved labor, eventually selling parcels of land piece by piece, until only the main house and immediate grounds remained. What intrigued Sarah most were the gaps in the historical record, periods where the ownership of the property seemed unclear or where records had been lost to time and neglect. Local legends spoke of the plantation serving as a way station for various groups during the chaotic years following the Civil War, though details were scarce and often contradictory. One story that appeared in multiple sources involved the James Younger Gang, the notorious outlaws led by Frank and Jesse James, supposedly using rural Mississippi properties as hideouts during their flights from law enforcement. While historians debated the accuracy of such claims, the stories persisted, passed down through generations of local families who swore their great-grandparents had witnessed strange visitors and mysterious activities during the 1870s. Sarah wasn't particularly interested in treasure hunting or outlaw legends. Her focus was entirely practical, turning a crumbling plantation into a viable business that could support her daughter's medical needs while providing them with a stable home. But she understood the marketing value of mystery and history, the way a good story could transform a simple bed and breakfast into a destination. As she sat in her car, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the plantation's overgrown lawn, Sarah allowed herself a moment of honest fear. Everything she'd read about renovating historical properties suggested that unexpected problems were not just possible, but inevitable. Structural issues hidden behind walls, electrical systems that violated modern codes, plumbing that hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. Her savings account, already depleted by the property purchase, contained exactly $3,247, enough to cover maybe 2 months of basic expenses if she was careful. Her credit cards were maxed out from Emma's medical bills, and her nursing license, while portable, wouldn't help much in a rural area with limited healthcare facilities. But the alternative was staying trapped in a cycle of rent payments and mounting debt, watching her daughter's medical needs slowly consume whatever financial stability they might have achieved. At least here, on this forgotten piece of Mississippi history, Sarah owned something. For the first time in her adult life, she had an asset rather than just liabilities. The sound of gravel crunching under tires interrupted her thoughts. Trevor's white Honda Pilot pulled up beside her, and the young real estate agent emerged with his trademark nervous smile and a manila folder thick with documents. "Ready to make this official?" he asked, though his tone suggested he still couldn't quite believe anyone was actually going through with purchasing Magnolia Grove. Sarah took a deep breath, tasting the humid air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and possibility, and stepped out of her car to claim her family's future. The first night in the caretaker's cottage, Sarah lay awake, listening to sounds she couldn't identify. The old wooden structure creaked and settled around her like a living thing, each groan and whisper making her hyper-aware of how alone she and Emma were in this isolated corner of Mississippi. Through the thin walls, she could hear the night symphony of the rural South, crickets, tree frogs, and the occasional hoot of an owl. Sounds that would have been comforting if they weren't so unfamiliar to a woman who had spent most of her life surrounded by the urban hum of Jackson. Emma had adapted to their new environment with the resilience that children possess, but adults seem to lose. During the drive from Jackson, She'd peppered Sarah with questions about their new home, pressing her face against the car window as they turned onto the long, winding driveway that led to Magnolia Grove. "It looks like a castle," she'd whispered, and Sarah had felt a pang of guilt for not correcting her daughter's fairy tale interpretation of their decidedly unglamorous reality. The cottage itself was a modest two-bedroom structure that had probably housed plantation workers or overseers. In its original incarnation, someone in the 1960s had added modern amenities like indoor plumbing and electrical outlets, though both systems showed their age through inconsistent water pressure and outlets that sparked occasionally when appliances were plugged in. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person to move around comfortably, with appliances that belonged in a museum and countertops that had seen better decades. But Emma had claimed the smaller bedroom with enthusiasm, delighting in the window that looked out toward the main plantation house and the ancient oak trees that created natural climbing structures she was already planning to explore. Sarah had spent the evening unpacking their meager belongings, while Emma arranged her stuffed animals on the narrow bed, chattering about all the adventures they would have in their new home. Now, at 2 a.m, with Emma finally asleep, and the cottage settled into its nighttime rhythm, Sarah allowed herself to confront the magnitude of what she'd undertaken. Her nursing background had taught her to assess situations methodically, to break down overwhelming problems into manageable components. But sitting in the cottage's tiny living room with her laptop open to a spreadsheet of renovation costs, she felt the familiar panic that had become her constant companion over the past year. The main house loomed in the darkness beyond her window, its silhouette barely visible against the star-filled Mississippi sky. During daylight hours, the plantation's decay was obvious, but somehow manageable, the kind of project that could be tackled room by room with enough patience and determination. In the darkness, however, the house took on an almost malevolent presence, its broken windows like empty eye sockets staring down at the cottage with silent judgment. Sarah had spent the previous week researching bed and breakfast operations, reading forums where other property owners shared their experiences with historical renovations. The stories ranged from inspiring success stories to cautionary tales of bankruptcy and foreclosure, with most falling somewhere in between. The consensus seemed to be that historical properties required not just financial resources, but an almost infinite capacity for problem-solving and an ability to maintain optimism in the face of constant setbacks. One forum post that had particularly stayed with her came from a woman in Louisiana who had purchased a similar antebellum property with dreams of creating a luxury retreat. "Year 1 is about survival," she'd written. "You'll discover problems you never knew existed, spend money you don't have on things you never planned for, and question your sanity on a daily basis. But if you can make it through that first year, you'll start to see the vision becoming reality." Sarah's immediate challenges were both practical and financial. The cottage's electrical system, while functional, couldn't handle more than basic appliances without tripping breakers. The well water, though safe according to recent tests, had a sulfur taste that made everything from coffee to pasta unpalatable. Most urgently, Emma's medical appointments in Jackson required a 3-hour round trip that ate into both time and gas money they couldn't afford to waste. During her research phase, Sarah had contacted Dr. Patricia Williams, Emma's cardiologist, about the logistics of continuing treatment while living 90 minutes from Jackson. Dr. Williams had been understanding but firm about the importance of maintaining Emma's regular checkup schedule, particularly given the recent changes in her medication regimen. Rural living can actually be beneficial for children with heart conditions, Dr. Williams had explained during their last appointment before the move. Less pollution, more opportunities for gentle exercise, reduced stress. But we can't compromise on monitoring her progress, especially during these crucial developmental years. The compromise they'd reached involved scheduling Emma's appointments in clusters, allowing for full days in Jackson that could accommodate multiple medical visits while minimizing travel frequency. Sarah had also identified a family practice physician in the nearby town of Meridian, who could handle routine care and serve as a local contact for emergencies. Beyond the medical logistics, Sarah faced the challenge of generating income while managing the plantation renovation. Her nursing license allowed her to work as a traveling nurse, taking short-term assignments at hospitals throughout the region, but such work required flexibility that was difficult to maintain while caring for Emma and overseeing construction projects. The bed and breakfast plan, while promising in the long term, wouldn't generate revenue for at least 18 months, assuming everything went according to schedule. Sarah had calculated that she needed to restore a minimum of 4 guest rooms in the main house to achieve the occupancy rates necessary for financial viability, a project that would require professional contractors for electrical and plumbing work even if she tackled cosmetic improvements herself. Her days quickly settled into a rhythm of necessity. Morning hours were devoted to Emma's homeschooling, a decision driven more by logistics than educational philosophy. The local elementary school, while adequate, required a 40-minute bus ride each way over rural roads that turned treacherous during Mississippi's frequent rainstorms. Homeschooling allowed Sarah to tailor Emma's education around their unusual circumstances, while maintaining the flexibility needed for medical appointments and renovation work. Afternoons became Sarah's time for exploring the main house, methodically, documenting the work required in each room while teaching herself basic construction skills through YouTube videos and library books. The plantation house revealed its secrets slowly, each room presenting new challenges and occasional surprises that kept her alternating between despair and cautious optimism. The formal dining room, with its hand-carved wainscoting and original crystal chandelier, required primarily cosmetic restoration once the water damage from a roof leak was addressed. The kitchen, however, was a disaster of outdated appliances, dangerous electrical connections and plumbing that seemed to defy both logic and gravity. The grand staircase, which dominated the central hallway, was structurally sound, but bore the scars of decades of neglect in its scratched banisters and loose spindles. What fascinated Sarah most were the architectural details that spoke to the house's original grandeur. Hand-painted ceiling medallions in the formal parlor, imported marble mantels that had somehow survived generations of changing tastes, and hardwood floors that, beneath layers of grime and scratched varnish, revealed the rich patina of old growth. Cypress and oak. Emma accompanied her mother on these explorations, treating the empty rooms like a vast playground, while Sarah took measurements and made notes. The little girl had claimed the house's tower room as her special place, a circular chamber at the top of a narrow staircase that offered panoramic views of the surrounding countryside. Sarah had initially been nervous about Emma playing in the tower, but structural inspection revealed it to be one of the most solid parts of the building. its thick walls and stone foundation having weathered decades better than the rest of the house. Evenings were reserved for research and planning, hours spent hunched over her laptop while Emma drew pictures or read books from the collection they'd brought from Jackson. Sarah studied renovation techniques, researched historical preservation requirements, and slowly built relationships with local contractors through email exchanges and phone calls. The financial reality of her situation became clearer with each passing day. Professional estimates for essential repairs ranged from $75,000 to $120,000, figures that might as well have been $1 million given her current resources. But Sarah had learned to break down overwhelming projects into smaller, manageable tasks, focusing on what could be accomplished with sweat equity rather than cash expenditure. Her plan evolved into a phased approach. Secure the structure against further deterioration. Tackle cosmetic improvements in rooms that could generate early revenue and gradually work toward full restoration as the business became profitable. It was a long-term strategy that required patience, but it was also the only viable path forward given her circumstances. The local community proved to be a mixture of curiosity and skepticism regarding Sarah's plans for Magnolia Grove. Miss Dorothy Henderson, who owned the small grocery store in the nearby town of Oakwood, had been forthright in her assessment during Sarah's first shopping trip. "That place has been trouble for every family that's owned it," Miss Dorothy had said while ringing up Sarah's purchases. "Beautiful property, don't get me wrong, but it seems to wear people down. You might want to consider what you're getting yourself into before you get in too deep." Other locals were more encouraging, particularly those who remembered the plantation's better days. Thomas Caldwell, a retired carpenter who lived about 5 miles down the road, had stopped by during Sarah's second week to introduce himself and offer assistance with minor repairs. "My grandfather worked on that house back in the 1940s, Thomas had explained while examining the cottage's sagging front porch. "He always said it was built to last, just needed folks who understood how to maintain it properly. You've got good bones to work with, and that's more than most people can say about old houses these days." Thomas became Sarah's first local ally, offering advice on everything from foundation issues to the best suppliers for historical restoration materials. He also provided something equally valuable: perspective from someone who understood both the challenges and the potential of what she was attempting. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to notice patterns in the house's deterioration that suggested previous owners had made strategic choices about which problems to address and which to ignore. Water damage was concentrated in specific areas, indicating that roof repairs had been piecemeal rather than comprehensive. Electrical work showed multiple generations of updates, some professional and others clearly DIY efforts of varying quality. But there were also signs of care and attention that gave her hope. Hidden behind decades of amateur paint jobs, she discovered original murals in the front parlor that depicted scenes from classical mythology. Beneath layers of linoleum in the kitchen, she found original brick flooring that could be restored to create exactly the kind of authentic atmosphere that would appeal to bed and breakfast guests. Each small discovery felt like a message from the house's past, reminders that Magnolia Grove had been someone's beloved home long before it became a problem property. Sarah began to understand that her role wasn't just to renovate a building, but to serve as steward for a piece of history that deserved preservation rather than demolition. The financial pressure remained constant, but it was balanced by growing confidence in her decision. Emma was thriving in their rural environment, her health stable, and her spirits high as she explored their new home. And Sarah herself felt something she hadn't experienced in years: ownership, not just of property, but of her family's destiny. Standing on the plantation's front porch each evening, watching the sun set over land that belonged to her daughter's future, Sarah allowed herself to believe that sometimes the most desperate decisions turned out to be the wisest ones. The morning that would change everything began like any other, with Emma practicing her arithmetic at the cottage's small kitchen table, while Sarah reviewed contractor estimates over her second cup of sulfur-tinged coffee. October had arrived in Mississippi with its characteristic burst of relief, trading the oppressive summer humidity for crisp mornings and afternoons that actually invited outdoor work. Sarah had been living at Magnolia Grove for 6 weeks. Long enough to establish routines, but not long enough to feel truly settled. Her savings had dwindled to $1,847, a figure that kept her awake most nights, calculating and recalculating how long they could survive before she'd be forced to find traditional employment. The bed and breakfast dream felt increasingly distant, with each passing day overshadowed by the immediate realities of keeping Emma fed, medicated, and educated, while maintaining a crumbling property that seemed determined to reveal new problems with mathematical precision. "Mama, can we explore the secret passage today?" Emma asked, looking up from her worksheet with the kind of hopeful expression that made Sarah's heart ache. Her daughter had been fascinated by what she called secret passages since discovering that several of the plantation's interior doors led to narrow servant staircases that connected different floors of the house. "After you finish your math lesson," Sarah replied, though she was already mentally preparing for another afternoon of following Emma through dusty corridors while pretending to share her daughter's enthusiasm for exploration. These adventures had become Emma's favorite part of homeschooling, treating the plantation house like an elaborate puzzle waiting to be solved. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her daughter's imagination was probably the only thing keeping either of them sane. While Sarah saw deteriorating infrastructure and mounting repair costs, Emma saw mystery and possibility. The child had already assigned names to different rooms based on their architectural features and had created elaborate backstories for the plantation's former inhabitants. Thomas Caldwell arrived at 9:30, as had become his Tuesday routine, bringing coffee that didn't taste like sulfur and a wealth of practical knowledge about historic home renovation. At 73, Thomas moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades working with his hands, and his presence had become one of the few reliable comforts in Sarah's increasingly uncertain world. "Morning, ladies," he called from the cottage's front porch, his voice carrying the slow cadence of rural Mississippi. "Ready to tackle that floor situation in the dining room?" The dining room floor had become Sarah's most pressing concern after she discovered that several floorboards in the room's center sagged ominously under weight. Thomas had assured her that the problem was likely isolated to damaged subflooring rather than foundational issues, but verification required removing the warped boards to assess the damage underneath. "Emma's been asking about the servant passages again," Sarah said, as Thomas set down his toolbox and accepted a cup of Emma's preferred coffee. "I keep meaning to map them out properly, but frankly, they make me nervous. Some of those staircases look like they haven't been maintained in decades." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Your grandfather and I explored every inch of this house when we were boys. His family worked for the Whitmores during the Depression, and I used to tag along when he helped with odd jobs around the property. Those passages were designed for house staff to move between floors without disturbing the family, but they were also used for other purposes during certain periods of the house's history." Emma perked up at this, abandoning her arithmetic entirely. "What kind of other purposes?" "Well," Thomas said, settling into the cottage's single comfortable chair, "during the 1870s and 1880s, this part of Mississippi saw its share of folks who preferred to travel without drawing attention to themselves. The James Younger gang was active in this region for several years after the Civil War, and local families had to make some difficult decisions about hospitality and safety." Sarah had heard variations of this story from several locals, though. Details varied significantly depending on who was telling it. The Jesse James connection was part of Magnolia Grove's local legend, the kind of historical footnote that added intrigue to property listings, but was difficult to verify through official records. "You really think outlaws hid here?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with the kind of excitement that made Sarah simultaneously proud of her daughter's curiosity and worried about encouraging fantasies that might be disappointed by reality. "I think," Thomas said carefully, "that during chaotic times, people did what they had to do to survive. And I think this house has seen more history than most folks realize." After Thomas and Emma headed to the main house to examine the dining room floor, Sarah remained at the cottage to handle the morning's administrative tasks. Emma's medical insurance required monthly documentation of their address change, and Sarah spent an hour on hold with various bureaucratic departments, explaining repeatedly that yes, they had moved to rural Mississippi, and no, this was not a temporary arrangement. The insurance situation had become increasingly complicated since the move. Emma's specialized care was covered under Sarah's former employer's group plan, but maintaining that coverage required her to work a minimum number of hours per month as a traveling nurse. Sarah had managed to secure a 3-day assignment at a hospital in Meridian for the following week, but the irregular schedule made it difficult to plan renovation work or maintain consistent homeschooling routines. By the time Sarah joined Thomas and Emma at the main house, they had already removed 6 floorboards from the dining room and were examining the subflooring underneath. The damage was less extensive than Sarah had feared, limited to 3 joists that showed signs of water damage from an old roof leak that had been repaired years earlier. "This is definitely fixable," Thomas announced, running his hands along the damaged wood. "We'll need to sister these joists and replace the subflooring in this section, but it's not a major structural issue. You could probably handle most of the work yourself with some guidance." Emma had lost interest in the technical aspects of floor repair and was exploring the dining room's built-in china cabinet, a massive piece of furniture that stretched from floor to ceiling along the room's eastern wall. The cabinet's lower section featured a series of storage compartments that Emma had been systematically investigating, treating each drawer and cabinet door like a treasure chest waiting to be opened. "Mama, look at this," Emma called from behind the cabinet. "There's something weird back here." Sarah and Thomas exchanged glances before following Emma's voice to the narrow space between the cabinet and the wall. The child had somehow squeezed into the gap and was running her hands along what appeared to be a section of wall that didn't quite align with the rest of the room's architecture. "Emma, come out of there before you get stuck," Sarah said, but Thomas was already examining the area with increased interest. "Hold on," he said, producing a small flashlight from his pocket and directing its beam toward the wall section Emma had discovered. "This is interesting. That's not original construction." What Emma had found was a section of wall that had been added sometime after the room's initial construction, creating a narrow space behind the built-in cabinet. The newer wall was constructed from different materials and showed signs of having been installed hastily without the attention to detail evident in the rest of the house. "Could be anything," Thomas mused, though his tone suggested he found the discovery more intriguing than he was letting on. Sometimes people modified these old houses for practical reasons: storage space, updated utilities, that sort of thing. But Emma was undeterred by adult caution. She had managed to work her way further into the gap and was now calling out descriptions of what she could see in the narrow space. "There's like a door back here, but it's not a real door. More like a little door for dolls or something." Sarah's maternal instincts were warring with curiosity. The space was clearly too small for Emma to get seriously stuck, and the child's excitement was infectious, but old houses contained numerous potential hazards, from loose nails to unstable structures. Thomas, however, was becoming increasingly interested in Emma's discovery. "Can you describe this door more specifically? Is it set into the wall, or does it look like a separate piece?" "It's in the wall, and it has a little handle, but the handle is weird. It looks like a flower or something." Thomas's expression shifted to something approaching excitement. "Emma, I want you to come out of there right now, but first, can you tell me what color the flower handle is?" "It's kind of brown and green, like it's really old. And there are letters on it, but I can't read them because they're all fancy." Sarah was about to insist that Emma emerge from the narrow space when Thomas placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Sarah, I think your daughter may have found something significant. The Whitmore family had a reputation for hiding valuables during the Civil War and Reconstruction period. What Emma's describing sounds like it could be a concealed safe or storage compartment." The possibility that Emma had discovered some kind of hidden storage sent a thrill through Sarah that she tried to suppress. Treasure hunting was exactly the kind of distraction she couldn't afford, not when she was already struggling to balance renovation costs with survival expenses. But as Emma finally emerged from behind the cabinet, her face flushed with excitement, and her clothes covered in decades of accumulated dust, Sarah found herself caught up in her daughter's enthusiasm despite her better judgment. "We have to see what's inside," Emma announced with the absolute certainty that only 8-year-olds possessed. "It might be really important." Thomas was examining the cabinet itself now, running his hands along its edges and testing whether it could be moved away from the wall. The piece was clearly custom-built for the space it occupied, its proportions exactly matching the room's dimensions, and its construction suggesting it had been installed as a permanent fixture. "This cabinet wasn't just placed here," he observed. "It was built in place, probably specifically to conceal whatever Emma found behind it. Moving it would require dismantling it piece by piece, and even then, we might not be able to access that compartment without damaging the wall." Sarah felt the familiar tension between practical concerns and curiosity that had become a constant theme since moving to Magnolia Grove. Every decision required weighing immediate costs against potential benefits, and most potential benefits had proven to be either illusory or prohibitively expensive to pursue. "How much would it cost to properly investigate this?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Time more than money," Thomas replied, "but probably several days of careful work to avoid damaging either the cabinet or whatever's behind it, and no guarantee that whatever we find would be worth the effort." Emma, however, was already making plans that didn't include adult caution or financial considerations. "We could just look inside real quick, couldn't we? Just to see if there's anything interesting." The weight of Emma's expectation, combined with Thomas's obvious interest and her own curiosity, created a momentum that Sarah found difficult to resist. She thought of all the practical projects that demanded attention, all the immediate needs that required her focus and resources. But she also thought of Emma's excitement, the first genuine enthusiasm her daughter had shown since the upheaval of their move. And she thought of her own life, how carefully she'd planned and budgeted and prepared for every contingency, only to end up broke and desperate in a crumbling plantation house. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the most practical decision was to allow room for possibility. Standing in the dining room of her impossible house, watching her daughter's eyes shine with the prospect of discovery, Sarah made a choice that felt both reckless and inevitable. "All right," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Let's see what we can find." The next 3 days transformed into an archaeological expedition that consumed every waking hour of their lives. Thomas arrived each morning at dawn with increasingly sophisticated tools borrowed from friends throughout the county, while Emma appointed herself chief documentation officer, carefully sketching every step of their progress in a composition notebook she dedicated to what she called the Great Discovery Project. Sarah found herself torn between mounting anticipation and practical dread as they slowly dismantled sections of the built-in cabinet. Each piece of ornate woodwork they removed revealed more evidence that the concealment had been deliberate and sophisticated, far beyond what would be expected for simple storage needs. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing. Thomas observed on the second day as they carefully removed a section of decorative molding that had been hiding a complex system of wooden pegs and sliding panels. "This isn't amateur work. Someone invested serious time and craftsmanship into making sure whatever's back there stayed hidden." The cabinet's construction was a masterpiece of concealment engineering. What appeared to be solid backing was actually a series of removable panels held in place by a mechanism that required specific pieces to be removed in precise sequence. One wrong move would have locked the entire system, making discovery nearly impossible without destroying the cabinet entirely. Emma's discovery of the flower-shaped handle had been the key to understanding the system. The handle, which Thomas identified as a brass rose with the initials JWY, worked in conjunction with 3 other concealed mechanisms scattered throughout the cabinet's interior. Only by manipulating all 4 elements in the correct order could they access the hidden compartment behind. JWY, Sarah repeated, running her finger over the worn brass letters. "Any idea what that might stand for?" Thomas paused in his work, a strange expression crossing his weathered features. "Actually, I might. My grandfather used to tell stories about the James Younger gang, and one of the things he mentioned was that they sometimes used initials instead of full names when they were trying to avoid detection. Jesse Woodson James, Frank Alexander James, Cole Thomas Younger. The implications, of Thomas's observation sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the October weather. If the concealment system was connected to the notorious outlaw gang, then whatever lay behind the wall might be far more significant than family heirlooms or Civil War-era valuables. By the afternoon of the third day, they had successfully navigated the cabinet's security system and gained access to what lay beyond. Behind the false wall was a narrow chamber, barely 3 feet wide, but extending the full height of the room. The space was lined with fitted shelves, and more importantly, those shelves were not empty. Emma was the first to peer into the hidden chamber, her small frame allowing her to squeeze through the opening they'd created. Her gasp of amazement brought both adults rushing to see what she'd discovered. "There are books," Emma whispered, her voice filled with reverence. "Lots and lots of books, and boxes, and something that looks like a treasure chest," Thomas managed to work his way into the chamber next, emerging with a leather-bound journal that appeared to be in remarkable condition given its apparent age. The journal's cover bore the same JWY initials they'd found on the brass handle, and its pages were filled with detailed handwriting in faded but still legible ink. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the journal to its first page, where an inscription read, "Property of Jesse W. James, commenced this record October 15, 1874. At the Magnolia Grove safe house, with gratitude to Colonel Whitmore for his continued assistance to our cause." The words seemed to shimmer on the page as Sarah read them aloud. Thomas sank into the room's single remaining chair, his face pale with the magnitude of what Emma had discovered. "Sweet Lord," he breathed. "Your daughter just found Jesse James's personal journal." But the journal was only the beginning. As they carefully extracted items from the hidden chamber over the following hours, the scope of the discovery became overwhelming. In addition to the journal, they found a collection of detailed maps marking locations throughout Missouri, Arkansas, and Mississippi, correspondence between gang members using coded language, and most significantly, what appeared to be detailed financial records documenting the proceeds from numerous bank and train robberies. Emma, meanwhile, had become fixated on what she'd accurately identified as a treasure chest. The wooden box was smaller than the dramatic pirate treasure chests of children's stories, but its brass fittings and heavy construction suggested it contained something of considerable value. "Can we open it?" Emma asked for the 10th time. Bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement, Sarah was afraid to touch the chest, let alone open it. Everything they'd discovered so far suggested they were dealing with historical artifacts of potentially enormous significance, and she was acutely aware that improper handling could destroy evidence, or worse, land them in legal trouble if the items belonged to museums or government collections. Thomas, however, was studying the chest with the careful attention of someone who understood old mechanisms. "This lock is original to the piece," he observed, running his fingers along the brass fittings. "But it's not engaged. Whoever put this here left it unlocked." The chest opened with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Inside, nestled in fitted compartments lined with faded velvet, lay what appeared to be a fortune in gold coins, jewelry, and other valuables. But more importantly, tucked beneath the treasures was a folded document that would prove to be the most significant discovery of all. The document, written in the same careful handwriting as the journal, was titled "Final Testament and Map to the Primary Cache, October 1881. It was signed by Jesse James and witnessed by Frank James and Cole Younger, and it detailed the location of what it described as the accumulated wealth of 7 years' work, secured for the families of fallen comrades and the continuation of our cause. According to the document, the chest they'd discovered contained only a fraction of the gang's accumulated wealth. The majority of their stolen money and gold had been buried in a location marked on an accompanying map, with specific instructions for recovery that included reference points, measurements, and coded landmarks. Sarah stared at the map with growing disbelief. The location it described was on Magnolia Grove property, specifically in an area near the creek that ran along the northern boundary of their land. According to Jesse James's own notes, the primary cache contained gold coins and banknotes worth an estimated $47,000 in 1881 values. Thomas was doing rapid calculations on the back of an envelope. Even conservative estimates would put 1881 gold dollars at 40 to 50 times current value, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We're potentially talking about $2 million or more in today's money. Emma, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the patience of a child who sensed something momentous was happening, finally spoke up. Does this mean we're rich now? Sarah's mind was reeling with implications that extended far beyond financial considerations. If the documents were authentic, they represented a significant addition to American historical knowledge about one of the country's most notorious outlaw gangs. But they also raised complex questions about ownership, legal obligations, and the proper handling of such discoveries. We need to be very careful about how we proceed, Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. Part of her wanted to grab the map and start digging immediately, while another part urged extreme caution about disturbing what might be an archaeological site of historical importance. Thomas was examining the map with increasing excitement. These landmarks are all still here, he said, pointing to various markings on the hand-drawn document. That stand of oak trees, the bend in the creek, even this old foundation marker. If this map is accurate, we could locate the cache relatively easily. The ethical implications of treasure hunting on her own property were complex enough without adding the historical significance of Jesse James artifacts. Sarah found herself wishing she had someone to consult, an expert who could advise her on both the legal and practical aspects of what they'd discovered. But as she looked at Emma's expectant face and thought about their dwindling financial resources, the practical considerations began to outweigh her cautions. The gold, if it existed, and if they could find it, represented not just financial security, but the possibility of completing the plantation renovation without debt or compromise. The property deed gives us mineral rights, Thomas observed, apparently following a similar line of thinking. Legally, anything buried on your land belongs to you, regardless of how it got there. Sarah spent that evening alone in the cottage, reading through Jesse James's journal while Emma slept. The outlaw's voice came through clearly in his careful handwriting, revealing a man far more complex than the folk hero of popular legend. His entries described not just robberies and escapes, but philosophical justifications for his actions, concerns about the welfare of his men, and detailed observations about post-Civil War society. The journal painted a picture of the James Younger gang as more than common criminals. In Jesse's telling, they were Confederate veterans who refused to accept defeat, men who saw their robberies as a continuation of the Civil War by other means. Whether that self-perception was accurate or merely self-serving rationalization, the journal provided unprecedented insight into the gang's motivations and methods. More practically, the journal confirmed that Magnolia Grove had served as a safe house for the gang during the 1870s and early 1880s. Colonel Whitmore, the plantation's original owner, had apparently been a Confederate sympathizer who provided refuge for former soldiers engaged in what Jesse termed continued resistance to federal occupation. The arrangement had been mutually beneficial. The gang received sanctuary and logistical support, while Colonel Whitmore received financial compensation that helped him maintain the plantation during the economically devastating Reconstruction period. According to Jesse's notes, they had buried their accumulated wealth on the property as insurance against capture, intending to return for it once the federal pressure decreased. But Jesse James had been killed in 1882. Frank James had surrendered to authorities, and the surviving gang members had apparently never returned to claim their cachet. The secret had died with them, leaving $40 million in gold and currency buried somewhere on Sarah's property for nearly 150 years. As she closed the journal and prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Tomorrow, she would begin the search for Jesse James's buried treasure, not because she believed in fairy tale endings, but because sometimes desperate situations called for desperate measures. Standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit landscape that held such extraordinary secrets, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future where money wasn't a constant source of anxiety, where Emma's medical needs could be met without financial stress, where the plantation could be restored to its former glory without compromise. For the first time since moving to Magnolia Grove, Sarah fell asleep without calculating expenses or worrying about tomorrow's problems. Instead, she dreamed of gold coins glinting in Mississippi soil, and of her daughter's laughter echoing through a fully restored plantation house. The first attempt to locate the buried cache proved that treasure hunting was significantly more difficult than movies suggested. Armed with Jesse James's map, a borrowed metal detector from Thomas's nephew, and Emma's boundless enthusiasm, Sarah spent an entire Saturday methodically searching the area near the creek that the map indicated as the burial site. The metal detector, a temperamental device that seemed to find every discarded bottle cap and fence staple within a 50-yard radius, produced a symphony of false alarms that left Sarah's nerves frayed and her optimism considerably dimmed. Emma treated the expedition like an elaborate game of hide-and-seek, racing between the various landmarks marked on the map and offering increasingly creative interpretations of Jesse James's cryptic notations. Maybe when he wrote 30 paces north of the lightning tree, he meant really big steps, Emma suggested after their third failed attempt to locate anything significant near the massive oak that bore obvious scars from an old lightning strike. Maybe he had really long legs. Thomas, who had joined them for the afternoon search, was more methodical in his approach. He'd brought surveying equipment borrowed from a friend in the construction business and spent most of the day taking precise measurements while consulting both the historical map and modern property surveys. "The problem," he explained to Sarah during a break, "is that landmarks change over 140 years. That creek has probably shifted its course multiple times, trees have fallen and new ones have grown, and there's no guarantee that the reference points Jesse used are still identifiable. By late afternoon, they had covered nearly 10 acres without finding anything more significant than old farm equipment and the occasional Civil War-era bullet. Sarah found herself oscillating between disappointment and relief. Part of her had begun to worry about the complications that would arise from actually finding a fortune in buried gold, while another part couldn't ignore the mounting bills that continued to arrive daily. Emma's attitude remained relentlessly positive despite their lack of success. "We'll find it tomorrow," she announced with the confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned that life rarely cooperated with childhood optimism. "Maybe we just need to think like outlaws instead of regular people." That evening, Sarah spread Jesse James's journal and maps across the cottage's kitchen table, studying them by lamplight while Emma worked on her schoolwork nearby. The outlaw's handwriting, initially difficult to decipher, was becoming more familiar with repeated reading, and certain details that had seemed insignificant during the day began to take on new meaning. One entry, dated November 3, 1878, caught her attention. "Moved the primary cache today due to increased federal activity in the region. New location provides better concealment and multiple escape routes should discovery become imminent. Frank expressed concerns about accessibility, but security must take precedence over convenience." The implication that the treasure had been moved from its original burial site was both discouraging and illuminating. If Jesse had relocated the cache in 1878, then the map they'd been following might be outdated, referring to the original location rather than the final resting place. Sarah continued reading through the journal entries, looking for any mention of the cache's final location. The outlaw's writing style was methodical but frustratingly vague about specific details, probably a deliberate security measure in case the journal fell into the wrong hands. But buried in an entry from December 1878, she found what might be the key to their search: final arrangements completed for the family legacy, location chosen for permanence and accessibility by trusted parties only. The rose points the way for those who understand the significance of loyalty and remembrance. The reference to the rose seemed significant, given the brass rose handle they'd discovered in the dining room cabinet. Sarah wondered if there might be other rose symbols hidden throughout the plantation that served as markers for the treasure's location. Her speculation was interrupted by a knock at the cottage door. Visitors were rare enough that both Sarah and Emma looked up in surprise. Through the window, Sarah could see an unfamiliar pickup truck parked in their driveway, and a tall man in work clothes standing on their porch. "Mrs. Martinez," the man said when Sarah opened the door. "My name is Bobby Hartwell. I live about 10 miles down the road, and I heard you folks have been doing some exploring around the old plantation." Bobby appeared to be in his 50s, with the weathered appearance of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His manner was friendly but cautious, and Sarah sensed he was measuring his words carefully. "Word gets around pretty fast in a small community," Sarah replied, inviting him inside. "We've been doing some renovation work on the main house, if that's what you mean." Bobby accepted her offer of coffee and settled into the cottage's living room with the ease of someone accustomed to impromptu social visits. Emma watched him with the frank curiosity that 8-year-olds directed toward all adult strangers, while Sarah tried to gauge whether his visit was merely neighborly or motivated by something more specific. "My great-grandfather used to work for the Whitmore family," Bobby began, stirring sugar into his coffee. Back in the 1920s and 30s, he was the property caretaker after the family moved away. He used to tell stories about the old days, including some tales about visitors the plantation used to get during the 1870s. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but tried to maintain a neutral expression. What kind of stories? Well, Bobby continued, according to family legend, the James Younger gang used this place as a hideout for several years after the Civil War. My great-grandfather claimed they buried something valuable on the property before they moved on, and that the Whitmore family knew about it, but never tried to dig it up. The fact that Bobby's family history corroborated what they'd discovered in Jesse James's journal was both reassuring and concerning. If local families had known about the treasure for generations, Sarah wondered why no one had attempted to find it before now. "Did your great-grandfather ever mention where this treasure might be buried?" Thomas asked, joining the conversation. Bobby smiled. "That's actually why I stopped by tonight. My great-grandfather drew a map of the property sometime in the 1940s, marking all the places he thought might be significant based on the stories he'd heard. I found it last week when I was cleaning out my grandmother's attic, and I thought you folks might find it interesting." He produced a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, spreading it out on the coffee table. The map showed Magnolia Grove as it had existed in the 1940s, with detailed notations about various landmarks and structures that no longer existed. What immediately caught Sarah's attention was a series of small symbols scattered across the property, each one shaped like a rose. The symbols were concentrated in 3 areas: near the main house, along the creek, and in a section of what was now overgrown forest on the eastern edge of their property. My great-grandfather believed the roses were markers, Bobby explained. He thought if someone could figure out the pattern, they might be able to locate whatever the outlaws left behind. Emma was studying the map with intense concentration, her finger tracing the various rose symbols. "There are 12 roses," she announced, "and they make a shape if you connect them with lines." Sarah looked more closely at the map, following Emma's observation. The child was right. The rose symbols, when connected, formed a rough circle with 3 additional markers, creating a triangle in the center. "A circle with a triangle inside," Thomas mused. "That's a pretty specific geometric pattern. Not likely to be coincidental." Bobby nodded. "My great-grandfather thought the same thing. He believed the triangle pointed to the burial site, but he never had the resources or the legal right to do any serious digging." Sarah studied the map more carefully, comparing it to both the modern property survey and Jesse James's original. Notations. The triangle formed by the interior rose symbols encompassed an area near what Jesse had described as the family legacy location, but it was significantly smaller and more precisely defined than their previous search area. "Would you be interested in a partnership?" Sarah found herself asking, though she wasn't entirely sure where the words came from. "If we do find anything, we could split it fairly among everyone who contributed to the search." Bobby's expression brightened considerably. "I was hoping you might say something like that. I've got metal detecting equipment that's a lot more sophisticated than what you've probably been using. Plus, some friends with ground-penetrating radar, if we need to get serious about this." The conversation that followed transformed their treasure, hunting from amateur hour into something approaching a professional operation. Bobby had access to equipment and expertise that could significantly improve their chances of success. while Sarah held the legal rights to the property and possession of Jesse James's original documents. They agreed to begin a systematic search the following weekend, focusing on the triangle area marked on Bobby's great-grandfather's map. Bobby would handle the technical aspects of the search, while Sarah and Thomas would provide historical context and site access. Emma, of course, appointed herself project coordinator and chief excitement officer, roles she planned to take very seriously. After Bobby left, Sarah found herself both energized and apprehensive about their expanded treasure hunting operation. More people meant better resources and expertise, but it also meant more complexity and potential complications if they actually found something significant. "What do you think?" she asked Thomas as they cleaned up the coffee cups. "Are we getting in over our heads?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "Probably," he admitted, "but you were already in over your head financially, and this might be your best chance of finding a way out. Besides, Bobby's family has as much connection to this story as anyone. If there's treasure to be found, they deserve a share of it." That night, Sarah lay awake calculating possibilities and probabilities. Even if they found Jesse James's cash, there would be complex questions about taxes, legal ownership, and the proper handling of historical artifacts. But there would also be the possibility of financial security for Emma's future, completion of the plantation renovation, and perhaps most importantly, the satisfaction of solving a mystery that had persisted for nearly 150 years. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather and a renewed sense of purpose. Sarah spent the day researching historical preservation laws and treasure hunting regulations, while Emma created elaborate charts tracking their various clues and discoveries. By afternoon, word had somehow spread through the local community that serious treasure hunting was about to commence at Magnolia Grove. Sarah found herself fielding phone calls from neighbors, amateur historians, and even a reporter from the local newspaper who had heard rumors about Civil War-era artifacts being discovered on the property. "Mrs. Martinez," the reporter said during his call, "I understand you've made some significant historical discoveries at your plantation. Would you be interested in sharing that story with our readers?" Sarah politely declined the interview request, explaining that any discoveries were still being researched and verified. But the phone call served as a reminder that their treasure hunting activities were no longer private family adventures. Standing on the plantation's front porch that evening, watching the sun set over land that might contain a fortune in buried gold, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since making the desperate decision to buy Magnolia Grove. 6 months ago, she'd been a struggling single mother working night shifts and counting pennies. Now she was the owner of a historic plantation, the possessor of authentic Jesse James artifacts, and potentially on the verge of discovering one of the most significant treasure hoards in American history. Whether the treasure hunting would lead to financial salvation or simply another expensive disappointment remained to be seen. But for the first time since Emma's diagnosis, Sarah felt like the protagonist of her own story rather than a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Tomorrow would bring metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and the systematic search for Jesse James's buried legacy. Tonight, she allowed herself to hope that sometimes desperate gambles paid off in ways that changed everything. The sophisticated equipment Bobby brought to their weekend treasure hunt transformed what had been immature exploration into something resembling a professional archaeological operation. His metal detector could distinguish between different types of metals and approximate burial depths, while the ground-penetrating radar unit, borrowed from a friend's surveying business, could identify underground anomalies without disturbing the soil. Emma treated the arrival of the high-tech equipment with the reverence usually reserved for Christmas morning, following Bobby around the property as he demonstrated the various devices and explained their capabilities. She had prepared for the day by creating what she called the official treasure map, a detailed drawing that combined Jesse James's original notations with Bobby's great-grandfather's rose symbols and her own observations about the properties. A current layout. The triangle points right here, Emma announced, placing her finger on a spot near the creek where 3 of the rose symbols converged. And if you measure 30 paces from the lightning tree like Jesse said, but use really big steps, like maybe a horse would take, you end up in almost the same place. Sarah had to admire her daughter's logic, even if it was based more on wishful thinking than scientific methodology. But as Bobby began his systematic scan of the triangle area, his equipment immediately registered multiple metallic anomalies beneath the surface. "This is unusual," he said, studying the readout from his metal detector. "Most old properties have scattered metal debris near the surface, but I'm getting consistent signals at depth, roughly 6 to 8 feet down, in a pattern that suggests deliberate placement rather than random accumulation." Thomas, who had arrived early to help coordinate the search, was examining the ground-penetrating radar display with growing excitement. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of geometric shapes on the screen. "Those aren't natural formations. Someone definitely buried something substantial in this area." The radar revealed what appeared to be a rectangular chamber, approximately 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet deep, located exactly where Emma's mathematical calculations had predicted. Additional scans showed 2 smaller chambers nearby, suggesting a complex burial system rather than a single cache. Jesse was thorough, Bobby observed, studying the radar patterns. "This looks like a professional operation, not just someone digging a hole and burying a strongbox." The discovery of underground chambers created a new set of challenges and decisions. Excavating the sites would require careful planning to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath, and Sarah was acutely aware that improper handling could destroy both historical artifacts and potential evidence of the find's authenticity. "We need to do this right," she said, though her voice carried the tension of someone trying to balance caution with mounting excitement. "If this really is Jesse James's treasure, it needs to be documented properly." Bobby nodded in agreement. "My buddy Jake works for the State Archaeological Survey. He's done plenty of historical excavations, and he owes me a favor. If we bring him in, we can make sure everything is handled professionally." Emma was less interested in archaeological protocols than in immediate results. "Can't we just dig a little bit to see what's down there?" she asked, bouncing on her toes with barely contained enthusiasm. "Just to make sure it's really treasure and not just old junk?" Sarah understood her daughter's impatience, but she also recognized that they had moved beyond casual treasure hunting into potentially significant historical discovery. Whatever lay buried in the triangle area had been placed there deliberately and left undisturbed for nearly 150 years. It deserved more respect than hasty excavation, motivated by curiosity and financial desperation. The decision to involve Jake Morrison, Bobby's friend from the Archaeological Survey, proved to be both wise and complicated. Jake arrived the following Tuesday with professional excavation equipment and an infectious enthusiasm for historical mysteries. But he also brought a sobering perspective on the legal and practical implications of their discovery. If this is authentic Jesse James material, Jake explained during his initial site assessment, it could be one of the most significant outlaw-related archaeological finds in American history. But that level of significance comes with obligations and complications that you need to understand before we proceed. Jake's concerns ranged from proper documentation and preservation of artifacts to potential claims by federal agencies, historical societies, and Jesse James's living descendants. He also pointed out that media attention from such a discovery could transform their quiet treasure hunt into a public spectacle that might compromise both their privacy and their legal rights to the find. On the other hand, Jake continued, if we do this correctly, document everything properly, and establish clear provenance for the artifacts, you could be looking at a discovery that's valuable both historically and financially. Sarah found herself once again weighing immediate needs against long-term considerations. Emma's next cardiology appointment was scheduled for the following month, and the associated medical bills would strain their already tight budget. The plantation's roof needed attention before winter, and her nursing income wasn't sufficient to cover both living expenses and major repairs. But Jake's warnings about publicity and potential legal complications were equally concerning. Sarah had moved to Magnolia Grove specifically to escape the complexities and pressures of urban life, not to become the center of a media circus surrounding buried treasure. What if we excavate one of the smaller chambers first? Bobby suggested during their planning session. That would let us verify what we're dealing with without disturbing the main site. Jake agreed that a limited test excavation would be both scientifically sound and legally prudent. They selected the smallest of the three chambers indicated by the ground-penetrating radar, located about 20 feet from the main site and measuring roughly 3 feet square. The excavation began on a crisp November morning, with Emma serving as official photographer, documenting each stage of the process with her digital camera, while maintaining a detailed written log of their discoveries. Sarah had initially worried that the careful, methodical pace of archaeological excavation would frustrate her daughter's natural impatience, but Emma approached the work with surprising seriousness. "This is like being a detective," Emma observed, as Jake carefully removed soil one layer at a time, screening each shovelful for artifacts or other evidence. Except instead of looking for clues about crimes, we're looking for clues about treasure. The first significant find came at a depth of 4 feet. A wooden crate approximately 2 feet square, wrapped in what appeared to be oiled canvas that had protected it from moisture and decay. The crate's construction was solid but utilitarian, suggesting it had been designed for long-term storage rather than display. Jake's hands were steady as he carefully lifted the crate from its earthen resting place, but Sarah could see the excitement in his eyes as he examined the canvas wrapping. Stenciled letters on the fabric read, "J.W. James, Personal Effects," confirming that they had indeed discovered part of Jesse James's hidden cache. Emma was practically vibrating with anticipation as they carried the crate to a work table Jake had set up under a makeshift canopy. "Can we open it now?" she asked for what seemed like the 100th time. "Please, can we open it now?" The crate opened with surprising ease, its hinges still functional despite nearly 150 years underground. Inside, packed in additional layers of oiled cloth, were items that provided an intimate glimpse into the life of America's most notorious outlaw. The contents included several leather-bound journals similar to the one they'd found in the dining room cabinet, a collection of letters tied with string, a small wooden box containing what appeared to be personal jewelry, and most significantly, detailed maps of the central United States, marking locations that presumably held importance for the gang's operations. But it was the wooden box that commanded everyone's immediate attention. Inside, nestled in fitted compartments, lay a collection of gold coins that gleamed as if they'd been minted yesterday. Jake's preliminary count suggested the box contained nearly 200 gold pieces of various denominations, representing a substantial fortune even by 19th century standards. "A conservative estimate," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're looking at $300,000 to $400,000 in gold, based on current market values, and that's just from the smallest cache." Sarah stared at the coins, each one representing possibilities she'd barely dared to imagine. Emma's medical care, the plantation renovation, financial security for their future, all of it suddenly seemed achievable rather than merely hopeful. But even as she calculated the immediate impact of their discovery, Sarah found herself drawn to the human artifacts in the crate. Jesse James's personal letters, written in the same careful handwriting she'd come to recognize, offered glimpses into his relationships with family members and fellow gang members. One letter, addressed to his wife Zerelda, spoke of his hopes for a peaceful future once the current troubles were resolved. Another, written to his brother Frank, discussed concerns about the safety of their hidden assets and detailed plans for their eventual recovery. "These documents are priceless from a historical perspective," Jake observed, carefully examining the letters with cotton gloves. "They provide insights into the James Younger gang that historians have never had access to before." Thomas, who had been quietly studying the maps found in the crate, suddenly looked up with an expression of amazement. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said, pointing to markings on one of the maps. "This shows the locations of all 3 caches, and according to these measurements, the main chamber is significantly larger than what we've excavated so far." The map indicated that the chamber they'd just opened was designated as personal reserve, emergency access only, while the main cache was labeled primary assets, family legacy protection. Mathematical notations suggested the main chamber contained approximately 10 times the volume of materials they'd just discovered. Emma had been following the adult conversation with the intensity of someone who understood that important decisions were being made. "So that means there's probably 10 times as much gold in the big chamber?" she asked, her eyes wide with the implications. "Potentially," Jake replied carefully. "But we need to remember that volume doesn't necessarily correlate with value. The main chamber might contain documents, weapons, or other materials that were important to the gang, but wouldn't have significant monetary value today." Sarah found herself facing a decision that felt both momentous and inevitable. They had confirmed beyond doubt that Jesse James's treasure was real and accessible, but excavating the main chamber would transform their private treasure hunt into something that couldn't be hidden or ignored. The coins from the first cache alone would solve her immediate financial problems and provide security for Emma's future. But the main chamber represented possibilities that extended far beyond personal financial gain. If it contained the majority of the James Younger gang's accumulated wealth, they were potentially looking at a discovery that would rewrite both their personal futures and American historical understanding of the post-Civil War period. Standing in the November sunshine, surrounded by 150-year-old artifacts that proved the most famous outlaws in American history had trusted her property with their most precious secrets, Sarah realized that her desperate gamble had succeeded beyond her wildest imagination. But success, she was learning, came with its own complex set of choices and responsibilities. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to be satisfied with the fortune they'd already discovered, or to risk everything on the promise of something even greater lying beneath the Mississippi soil. The decision to excavate the main chamber came after 3 sleepless nights of weighing risks against possibilities. Sarah had consulted with attorneys, researched historical precedents, and even spoken with a tax specialist about the implications of treasure discovery. The legal landscape was complex, but generally favorable. As the property owner, she held clear rights to anything found on her land, regardless of its historical origin. More importantly, the gold coins from the first cache had already transformed their immediate circumstances. A discreet sale of 20 coins through a reputable dealer in Jackson had generated enough cash to cover Emma's medical expenses for the next year and fund essential repairs to the plantation house. For the first time since moving to Magnolia Grove, Sarah could sleep without calculating survival expenses, but the main chamber represented something beyond financial security. According to Jesse James's notations, it contained what he termed the accumulated wealth of our righteous cause, suggesting a treasure trove that could fundamentally change not just their lives, but their understanding of what was possible. Emma had become the excavation's unofficial morale officer, approaching each day's work with an enthusiasm that infected even the normally cautious Jake. She had convinced her mother to let her stay home from formal lessons during the excavation, arguing successfully that she was receiving a better education in history, archaeology, and geology than any textbook could provide. Besides, Emma had pointed out with 8-year-old logic, how many kids get to help dig up Jesse James's treasure? This is like the most important homework assignment ever. The main chamber excavation began on a cold December morning with equipment borrowed from Jake's archaeological survey connections. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed a complex underground structure that extended deeper than their initial estimates, suggesting that Jesse James and his associates had invested considerable time and effort in creating a secure, long-term storage facility. "This isn't just a hole in the ground," Jake observed, as they carefully removed soil layers according to proper archaeological protocols. "Someone designed this as a permanent installation with drainage systems and structural supports that were intended to last indefinitely." The first indication that the main chamber contained something extraordinary came at a depth of 6 feet, when Jake's careful excavation revealed the edge of what appeared to be a stone-lined chamber. The stonework was professional quality, fitted together with the precision of experienced masons, and showed no signs of deterioration despite nearly 150 years underground. "This is Confederate military engineering," Jake said with growing excitement as more of the structure was revealed. "I've seen similar work at Civil War fortification sites. Whoever built this had formal training in military construction techniques. Thomas, who had become the excavation's historical researcher, had discovered references in local records to a Confederate engineer named Captain Marcus Whitmore, apparently a relative of Colonel Whitmore, who had owned the plantation. Captain Whitmore had served with the Army of Tennessee and had been reported missing in action following the Battle of Nashville in 1864. It's possible Captain Whitmore survived the war and returned to help his family, Thomas suggested. If he was involved in constructing this chamber, it would explain the sophisticated engineering we're seeing. As the excavation progressed, the chamber's full dimensions became apparent: 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet deep, lined entirely with fitted stone and featuring a complex drainage system that had kept the interior completely dry. The chamber's entrance was sealed with a massive stone slab that required block and tackle equipment to move safely. Emma was the first person to peer into the chamber once the entrance was opened, her small frame allowing her to squeeze through the opening while the adults worked to widen access. A gasp of amazement echoed from within the stone chamber, followed by a whispered, "Oh my gosh," that carried more weight than any adult exclamation. "There are chests," Emma called from inside the chamber. "Lots and lots of chests. And bags, and something that looks like a safe." Jake descended into the chamber next, his headlamp illuminating what appeared to be the most significant outlaw treasure cache ever discovered in the United States. The chamber contained 17 wooden chests of various sizes, dozens of canvas bags marked with bank names from across the Midwest, and a large iron safe that bore the manufacturer's mark of a St. Louis company known for producing high-security commercial safes. Sarah's first glimpse into the chamber left her speechless. The sheer volume of materials suggested that the James Younger gang had been far more successful in their criminal endeavors than historical records indicated. But more than the quantity, it was the organization that impressed her. Everything was carefully arranged and labeled, suggesting that Jesse James had approached treasure storage with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized his other enterprises. The first chest they opened contained gold coins in quantities that defied immediate counting. The coins were organized by denomination and date, with careful notations indicating their origin and value. A preliminary assessment suggested this single chest contained more than 3,000 gold pieces, representing a value of several $1 million at current market prices, but the gold coins were only the beginning. Additional chests contained silver dollars, jewelry, precious stones, and items that appeared to be family heirlooms taken during various robberies. One chest was devoted entirely to pocket watches, each one carefully wrapped and labeled with details about its acquisition. Emma had appointed herself chief inventory officer, creating detailed lists of each item as it was carefully removed from the chamber. Her methodical approach impressed Jake, who observed that she was demonstrating natural archaeological instincts in her documentation techniques. "This watch belonged to a bank president in Kansas City," Emma read from one of Jesse's labels. "Taken during the Liberty Bank robbery, September 1876. Value estimated at $200 in current currency." The iron safe proved to be the chamber's most significant discovery. Unlike the wooden chests, which had been organized for quick access and transport, the safe contained items that Jesse James had apparently considered too valuable or sensitive for routine handling. Inside the safe, they found the gang's complete financial records, documenting 7 years of successful robberies with mathematical precision that would have impressed any legitimate business accountant. The records showed total accumulated wealth of $847,000 in 1881 currency values, with detailed breakdowns by source and location. More significantly, the safe contained what appeared to be Jesse James's personal memoir, a 200-page handwritten account of his life, motivations, and philosophy that provided unprecedented insight into one of America's most controversial historical figures. The memoir revealed Jesse not as a simple criminal, but as a complex individual who saw himself as a Confederate patriot, continuing resistance against federal occupation through unconventional means. This changes everything we thought we knew. About the James Younger gang, Jake said, carefully examining the memoir's pages. Jesse presents detailed justifications for his actions, describes the political and economic conditions that motivated him, and provides first-hand accounts of events that historians have only been able to piece together from newspaper reports and court records. But perhaps, most importantly, for Sarah's immediate concerns, the safe contained detailed instructions for converting the hidden wealth into usable assets without attracting federal attention. Jesse had apparently researched methods for gradually introducing stolen currency and gold into legitimate commerce, providing step-by-step procedures for transforming outlaw treasure into family security. The excavation's completion required 2 full weeks, with each day bringing new discoveries that expanded their understanding of both the treasure's scope and its historical significance. By the time Jake declared the chamber fully documented and excavated, they had recovered materials with an estimated value exceeding $40 million. Emma had maintained her detailed inventory throughout the process, creating what Jake praised as a professional quality archaeological record that would be invaluable for any future historical research. Her notebook contained descriptions, measurements, and photographs of more than 2,000 individual items, organized with an attention to detail that impressed even the professional archaeologist. "You've done better documentation than some graduate students I've worked with," Jake told Emma during their final day of excavation. "If you ever decide to become an archaeologist, you've already got excellent field experience." The treasure's discovery created immediate practical challenges that extended far beyond simple celebration. Sarah found herself responsible for safeguarding artifacts worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, while simultaneously managing the legal, financial, and security implications of such an extraordinary find. Her first priority was secure storage. The cottage's modest security was adequate for normal valuables, but completely inadequate for items worth millions of dollars. Sarah arranged for temporary storage in a bank vault in Jackson, while developing long-term plans for both security and gradual monetization of the discovery. The tax implications alone required consultation with specialists who had experience handling unusual income situations. While treasure discovery was legal, it was also taxable income that needed to be reported and managed according to federal and state requirements. But beyond the practical challenges, Sarah found herself grappling with the emotional impact of their success. 6 months earlier, she had been a struggling single mother facing potential bankruptcy and homelessness. Now she was the discoverer of one of the most significant treasure hoards in American history, with sufficient wealth to secure Emma's future and restore Magnolia Grove to its original grandeur. Emma seemed to be adapting to their changed circumstances. With the resilience that had characterized her response to every challenge in her young life, she had already begun making plans for the plantation's restoration, sketching room designs and researching historical furnishing options with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that their dreams had suddenly become achievable. "We can make it exactly like it was when Jesse James stayed here," Emma suggested during one of their evening planning sessions. "Except with modern medical equipment in case I need it, and really good internet so I can do research about treasure hunting." Standing in the cottage that evening, surrounded by historical artifacts that proved their desperate gamble had succeeded beyond imagination, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this extraordinary moment. The foreclosed plantation that everyone else had been afraid to buy had yielded secrets that would transform not just their lives, but their understanding of American history. But more than the financial security or historical significance, what struck Sarah most was the realization that sometimes the most desperate decisions led to the most extraordinary outcomes. Her choice to risk everything on Magnolia Grove had been motivated by desperation and hope in equal measure, and both had proven justified in ways she could never have imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they navigated the complex process of transforming buried treasure into sustainable security. But tonight, for the first time since Emma's diagnosis, Sarah fell asleep without worrying about medical bills, mortgage payments, or an uncertain future. Instead, she dreamed of a fully restored plantation house where her daughter could grow up, surrounded by history, security, and the knowledge that sometimes the most impossible dreams turned out to be the most achievable ones. The transformation of Magnolia Grove began before the last of Jesse James's treasure had been properly catalogued. Sarah had learned from her initial renovation struggles that successful historical restoration required professional expertise, and the treasure discovery had finally provided the resources to hire the craftsmen and specialists the project truly deserved. Marcus Reed, the historical preservation architect she consulted, brought 40 years of experience restoring antebellum properties throughout the South. His initial assessment of Magnolia Grove revealed both the extent of previous neglect and the remarkable opportunity that proper restoration represented. "This house is a time capsule," Marcus explained during his comprehensive inspection of the property. "Most plantation houses this age have been altered extensively over the decades, but Magnolia Grove retains virtually all of its original architectural details. With proper restoration, you could create one of the most authentic antebellum experiences available anywhere in the South." Emma had appointed herself liaison between her mother and the various contractors, architects, and craftsmen who began arriving at the plantation in a steady stream. Her detailed knowledge of the house's layout and history, combined with her natural curiosity about construction techniques, made her an invaluable asset to the restoration planning process. "The tower room needs to be my bedroom," Emma announced during one of the planning meetings, spreading her architectural sketches across Marcus's blueprints. "And we should put the library in the room where we found Jesse's treasure, because that's where all the important discoveries happen." The restoration work proceeded in carefully planned phases, designed to minimize disruption while maximizing historical authenticity. Marcus had assembled a team of craftsmen who specialized in period-appropriate techniques, from blacksmiths who could recreate original hardware to plasterers who understood traditional lime-based materials. Sarah found herself learning about aspects of historical preservation she'd never considered during her desperate initial renovation attempts. The difference between authentic restoration and mere repair work was evident in every detail, from the hand-forged nails used in structural work to the historically accurate paint colors mixed from original pigment formulas. Modern shortcuts might be faster and cheaper, Marcus explained, as they watched craftsmen carefully restore the dining room's hand-painted ceiling medallions, but they're also obvious to anyone who understands historical architecture. If you want Magnolia Grove to serve as a legitimate historical destination, authenticity has to be the priority in every decision. The financial freedom provided by Jesse James's treasure allowed Sarah to make decisions based on quality rather than cost for the first time in her adult life. Instead of accepting contractor estimates based on the cheapest possible materials and labor, she could choose craftsmen who understood and respected the house's historical significance. Emma's medical care also benefited dramatically from their changed circumstances. Dr. Williams had recommended a new treatment protocol that required specialized monitoring equipment, technology that was prohibitively expensive under their previous financial constraints, but easily affordable now. Emma's response to the new treatment has been excellent, Dr. Williams reported during their monthly appointment in Jackson. Her cardiac function has improved significantly, and the monitoring data suggests she's developing better exercise tolerance than we've seen previously. The improvement in Emma's health coincided with her obvious happiness about their new life at Magnolia Grove. The child had thrown herself into the restoration project with an enthusiasm that impressed even the professional craftsmen, learning traditional techniques and asking detailed questions about historical construction methods. That little girl knows more about 19th century architecture than some of my college interns, Marcus observed, after Emma had spent an afternoon learning about mortise and tenon joinery from the master carpenter working on the main staircase restoration. Local response to the plantation's restoration had been overwhelmingly positive, though Sarah was careful to manage information about the treasure discovery. She had decided to focus public attention on the historical preservation aspects of the project rather than the circumstances that had made it financially possible. We're restoring Magnolia Grove as a historical education center, Sarah explained to reporters who inquired about the extensive renovation work. The goal is to provide visitors with an authentic experience of antebellum plantation life, while addressing the complex historical realities of that period. Thomas Caldwell had become the restoration project's unofficial historian, working with Marcus to ensure that every detail reflected accurate historical practices. His research into the Whitmore family and the plantation's role during the Civil War and Reconstruction periods provided crucial context for restoration decisions. The Whitmores were typical of plantation families who supported the Confederate cause, but weren't necessarily the stereotypical slave-owning aristocrats, Thomas explained during one of their research sessions. They owned enslaved people, which was morally inexcusable, but they also provided sanctuary for Confederate veterans and resistance fighters who had nowhere else to go. Sarah had wrestled extensively with the ethical implications of restoring and promoting a plantation house. Her solution was to present Magnolia Grove's history honestly and completely, acknowledging both the wealth that enslaved labor had created and the complex circumstances that had led to its use as an outlaw sanctuary. "We can't change history," she decided during discussions with Marcus about interpretive materials for future visitors. But we can make sure people understand the full context of what they're seeing, including the human cost of the prosperity that built these houses. The restoration work revealed additional secrets that the house had kept for generations. Behind false walls in the servants' quarters, workers discovered letters and personal items that had belonged to enslaved people who had lived and worked at Magnolia Grove. The artifacts provided intimate glimpses into lives that had rarely been documented in official records. Emma had been the one to suggest that these discoveries deserved the same careful preservation and documentation as Jesse James's treasure. The people who lived here before the outlaws were important too, she pointed out, with the moral clarity that 8-year-olds sometimes possessed. Their stories should be told just as much as Jesse's story. Jake Morrison had remained involved in the project as both archaeological consultant and friend, helping to ensure that all historical discoveries were properly documented and preserved. His expertise proved invaluable when restoration work revealed additional hidden compartments and concealed spaces throughout the house. Plantation houses were designed with security in mind, Jake explained as they examined a newly discovered hiding place behind the library's built-in bookcases. Families who owned valuable property had to protect it from everything from theft to wartime confiscation, so concealed storage was a common architectural feature. The hidden spaces yielded additional artifacts from different periods of the house's history, creating an archaeological timeline that spanned from the antebellum period through Reconstruction and into the early 20th century. Each discovery added layers to their understanding of how the plantation had functioned and evolved over time. By spring, the main house's restoration had progressed enough to begin planning for its future use as an educational and historical destination. Sarah had decided to combine traditional bed and breakfast accommodations with guided tours and educational programs that would appeal to history enthusiasts and school groups. The key is balancing historical authenticity with modern comfort and safety, Marcus explained as they reviewed plans for guest room accommodations. Visitors want to experience history, but they also expect private bathrooms and climate control. Emma had become passionate about the educational aspects of the project, developing ideas for programs that would help other children understand both the excitement of historical discovery and the importance of preserving the past. Her own experience as a treasure hunter had given her unique insights into how to make history engaging and accessible. "We should have treasure hunts for kids who visit," Emma suggested during one of their planning sessions. "Not real treasure, but like puzzles and clues that teach them about the people who lived here and what their lives were like." The transformation of Magnolia Grove had attracted attention from historical preservation organizations throughout the region. Sarah found herself invited to speak at conferences about successful plantation restoration projects, though she continued to be discreet about the financial circumstances that had made the work possible. "What's remarkable about the Magnolia Grove project," observed Dr. Janet Richardson from the Mississippi Historical Society, "is how thoroughly it demonstrates that authentic restoration is possible when property owners are committed to historical accuracy rather than commercial compromise." The treasure discovery had also enabled Sarah to establish an educational foundation focused on historical preservation and archaeological research. The foundation provided grants to other families attempting similar restoration projects, while supporting professional research into Civil War and Reconstruction period history. Bobby Hartwell had become the Foundation's first full-time employee, using his local connections and research skills to identify other properties with historical significance that deserved preservation attention. His great-grandfather's knowledge of local history had proven invaluable in documenting stories and locations that might otherwise have been lost to time. There are dozens of properties in this region with historical significance, Bobby reported during the Foundation's first quarterly meeting. Most of the owners want to preserve their family heritage, but lack the resources to do proper restoration work. As summer approached, Magnolia Grove was ready to welcome its first guests since the Civil War era. The main house had been restored to museum-quality authenticity while incorporating modern amenities that ensured visitor comfort and safety. Guest rooms featured period furnishings and architectural details that transported visitors to the 1870s, while private bathrooms and climate control systems provided contemporary convenience. Emma had insisted on personally greeting the first, guests, a history professor from the University of Mississippi, and his wife, who had booked a weekend stay to research their own family's Civil War experiences. Her enthusiasm for sharing the plantation stories proved to be one of the property's most valuable assets. "That little girl knows more about this house than most museum guides," the professor observed, after Emma had provided an impromptu tour of the restoration work. "Her passion for the history is absolutely infectious." Standing on the plantation's restored front porch that evening, watching the sun set over land that had yielded such extraordinary secrets, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The desperate decision to risk everything on a foreclosed plantation had transformed not just their financial circumstances, but their understanding of what was possible when courage met opportunity. Emma was already making plans for their next adventure, talking about other historical mysteries they might investigate and other properties that might benefit from careful restoration. Her experience as a treasure hunter had awakened interests that would clearly shape her future in ways that neither of them could yet fully imagine. "We did it, Mama," Emma said that night as they sat together on the porch swing that had been restored using original hardware and traditional joinery techniques. "We really did find Jesse James's treasure, and now we get to live in the most beautiful house in Mississippi." Sarah smiled, thinking about how much their definition of treasure had expanded since that first desperate day when she'd gambled everything on an impossible dream. The gold and artifacts they'd discovered were certainly valuable, but the real treasure had been the journey itself. The discovery that sometimes the most desperate gambles led to the most extraordinary outcomes. Tomorrow would bring new guests, new stories to share, and new opportunities to demonstrate that historical preservation could be both authentic and economically viable. But tonight, surrounded by the fruits of their impossible success, Sarah allowed herself to believe that some fairy tales really did come true for families brave enough to bet everything on their dreams. 2 years after Emma's discovery of Jesse James's treasure, Magnolia Grove had become one of Mississippi's premier historical destinations. The plantation welcomed visitors from around the world who came to experience authentic antebellum history and learn about the remarkable treasure discovery that had made the restoration possible. Sarah stood in the main parlor on a crisp October morning, watching Emma guide a group of school children through the room where they'd first found Jesse's journal. At 10 years old, Emma had become the plantation's most popular tour guide, her first-hand knowledge of the treasure discovery combined with her natural storytelling ability, creating an experience that left visitors spellbound. "This is where we found the secret compartment," Emma explained to the wide-eyed children, demonstrating the brass rose mechanism that had unlocked Jesse James's hidden cache. The outlaws were really smart about hiding their treasure, but they left clues for people who knew how to look for them. The success of Magnolia Grove had exceeded Sarah's wildest projections. The bed and breakfast was booked solid through the following year, while educational tours and special events generated additional revenue that supported the ongoing preservation work. More importantly, the property had become a model for authentic, historical restoration that balanced entertainment with education. Emma's health had continued to improve dramatically. The specialized treatment made possible by their financial security had stabilized her cardiac condition to the point where Dr. Williams was optimistic about her long-term prognosis. The active lifestyle encouraged by their rural environment had strengthened both her physical condition and her confidence in ways that amazed everyone who knew her story. "Emma's transformation has been remarkable," Dr. Williams observed during their most recent appointment. "Not just her physical health, but her overall development. She's become a confident, articulate young person who's had experiences that most adults never get to enjoy." The treasure discovery had also led to unexpected developments in American historical research. Jesse James's memoir and financial records had provided scholars with unprecedented insights into the James Younger Gang's operations and motivations. 3 universities had established research programs based on materials discovered at Magnolia Grove, while the Smithsonian Institution had requested permission to create traveling exhibits featuring artifacts from the find. The Magnolia Grove discovery has revolutionized our understanding of post-Civil War resistance movements, explained Dr. Margaret Foster, a historian from Vanderbilt University who had written extensively about the James Younger Gang. Jesse's personal writings reveal motivations and strategies that historians had only been able to speculate about previously. Thomas Caldwell had become the unofficial guardian of the treasure's historical legacy, working with researchers to ensure that the artifacts were studied and preserved according to professional standards. His lifelong interest in local history had evolved into recognized expertise that was sought by institutions throughout the region. "The remarkable thing about this discovery," Thomas observed during a recent conference presentation, "is how it demonstrates that significant history is often hidden in plain sight. Families had been telling stories about outlaw treasure at Magnolia Grove for generations, but it took someone desperate enough to take those stories seriously." Bobby Hartwell had parlayed his role in the treasure discovery into a successful business as a historical research consultant. His combination of local knowledge and metal detection expertise had made him invaluable to other families attempting to research their properties' histories. The foundation Sarah had established provided funding for his work, with families who couldn't afford professional archaeological services. "We've identified 17 other properties in Mississippi and Louisiana that show evidence of Civil War or Reconstruction-era concealment," Bobby reported during the Foundation's annual meeting. "Most won't yield treasure like Magnolia Grove, but they all have stories worth preserving. Jake Morrison had returned to his position with the State Archaeological Survey, but he maintained close ties to Magnolia Grove and frequently brought student groups to study the restoration techniques and archaeological methods demonstrated there. The plantation had become an unofficial field school for historical preservation students from throughout the Southeast. Magnolia Grove represents the gold standard for historical restoration projects, Jake explained to his latest group of graduate students. It demonstrates how private preservation efforts can achieve results that government programs often struggle to match. The cottage where Sarah and Emma had lived during their first desperate months at the plantation had been restored as a museum exhibit documenting their treasure-hunting journey. Visitors could see Emma's original sketches and notes, the metal detection equipment they'd used, and photographs documenting each stage of the excavation process. Emma had insisted on including honest details about their financial struggles and the medical challenges that had motivated their move to Magnolia Grove. "People should know that we were really scared sometimes," she explained during the exhibit's planning phase. "Finding treasure wasn't just fun. It was something we really needed to happen." The exhibit had become one of the plantation's most popular attractions, particularly among families facing their own financial or medical challenges. Sarah received letters regularly from visitors who had been inspired by their story to pursue their own seemingly impossible dreams. "Your story gave me courage to start my own business," wrote a single mother from Alabama. "If you could bet everything on a broken-down plantation and find buried treasure, maybe I can take my own risks and see what happens." The financial security provided by the treasure discovery had allowed Sarah to pursue interests and opportunities she'd never imagined possible. She had completed a master's degree in historical preservation, using Magnolia Grove as the subject of her thesis on authentic restoration techniques. The degree had led to consulting opportunities with other preservation projects throughout the region. Emma had developed interests that reflected her unique experiences as a child treasure hunter and historical preservationist. She was already taking advanced courses in archaeology and historical research, while her artistic talents had been channeled into detailed architectural drawings that impressed professional craftsmen and historians alike. "I want to help other families find their own treasures," Emma announced during a recent interview with a regional magazine. "Not just gold and money, but the stories and history that make places special. Every old house has secrets if you know how to look for them." The success of Magnolia Grove had attracted media attention that Sarah had learned to manage carefully. She had become selective about interviews and publicity, focusing on opportunities that promoted historical preservation and education rather than sensationalizing the treasure discovery itself. "The real story isn't about finding gold," Sarah explained during a recent documentary interview. "It's about what happens when you're desperate enough to bet everything on an impossible dream and brave enough to do the work required to make that dream successful." As autumn settled over Magnolia Grove, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had transformed their lives so completely. The foreclosed plantation that had represented their last desperate gamble had become not just their home, but their life's work, connecting them to history in ways that enriched every aspect of their existence. Emma was already making plans for their next adventure, talking about other historical mysteries they might investigate and other preservation projects they might support through their foundation. Her enthusiasm for discovery remained as infectious as ever, tempered now by the knowledge and experience that came from having actually found treasure. "Mama," Emma said one evening as they sat on their restored front porch, "do you think Jessie—" James knew that someday a little girl would find his treasure and use it to save her family. Sarah smiled, thinking about the remarkable chain of events that had led them from desperation to abundance, from a crumbling house to a thriving historical destination. "I think," she replied, "that sometimes the universe has a plan that's bigger than anything we can imagine." Standing together on the porch of their impossible dream, surrounded by the fruits of courage and determination, Sarah and Emma looked forward to whatever adventures tomorrow might bring. They had learned that the greatest treasures weren't always buried in the ground. Sometimes they were found in the courage to risk everything on hope, the determination to work for what you believe in, and the wisdom to recognize that the most valuable discoveries often came disguised as desperate gambles. If this story of courage, determination, and impossible dreams has touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear that sometimes the most desperate decisions lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. Remember that treasure isn't always about gold and silver. Sometimes it's about finding the courage to bet everything on yourself and the people you love. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about ordinary people who discovered that extraordinary. Things happen when you're brave enough to pursue impossible dreams. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a tale that might just inspire you to take your own leap of faith. And remember, sometimes the greatest adventures begin when you have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Until next time, keep looking for the treasures hidden in your own life. They might be closer than you think.